Okay, so let's look at the family as a modern institution, which is really a phrase which comes from your textbook. When we use the word modern, at least in most sociological contexts, when we talk about modern, we're really talking about the process of industrialization. So this is a point in history when the political and economic power shifted from the land to the factory production, from, if you like, feudalism to capitalism. So we're looking at a political shift, and an economic and a social shift, because all three go together at a certain point in history, in the West, I should say, because this whole unit is predicated upon the history of the Western family as opposed to any other family grouping. So if we're talking about something modern, it's something that is associated with the Industrial Revolution. And because and it was called a revolution, this process was called a revolution because it changed. Revolutions change things. If you revolve a ball, you change the aspect from the top to the bottom. And if you revolve societies, you're also, in a revolution, you're changing almost everything about that society. You're changing the way people live, the things they believe in, the values that they hold in terms of each other, the power relationships between people. All of these things change profoundly with the emergence of industrial production. So you'll see that in all the histories of the family, if you're interested in doing the topic, and someone is on the history of the family, you'll see that there's a great deal written about the changes that the family underwent with the Industrial Revolution. So we'll look at that. This will be something we'll look at pictorially in a minute. When we're talking about an institution in sociology, what we're talking about is an entity, a collection of people or laws or values, something that exists independently of all of us as individuals. So I suppose you could say, well, you could talk about society, and to some extent we are, because society, the society we live in today, is made up of institutions. So you could have the educational institution, the legal institution. Can you think of any other? Oh, no, we're asking questions, sorry. What else can we do? Well, some people would say religion is an institution. It's a sort of force, it's a set of ideas and beliefs that exists independently of us as individuals. So it's more, in this case, the family is an institution, if we're going to say that. It's the family, we're not talking about the family we were born in and grew up in. What we're talking about is an entity. And again, this is an historical point. A group of people under the trees last week constituted an institution. That is to say that it created, through its own existence and through its survival, its search for survival, sets of relationships. It created sets of beliefs. It created a past and a present. It was, in other words, that group, and indeed the family today, exists as much as a set of ideas about and rules and values as it does in relation to a grouping of individuals who are related by blood, by intimate feelings, by parenthood and so on. Okay, so we're looking at the family as an institution in the industrial era, which I'll begin to do now. What we'll begin to explore is what constituted this thing called the family in the industrial world, and how did it come about that certain features could be identified within an industrial family. And the fourth point I want to make is to look not just at the institution related to industrialization, but look at the family as an institution, as it emerged post-industrialization, or we might want to say in postmodern societies, in the society that we now live in. The social formation that is associated with not local but globalized capitalism, And that, indeed, in post-industrial countries of the West, the first industrialized countries, live in very different ways in relation to each other than do if you like, the newly industrialized countries of the world. The primary one of interest might be our colleagues earlier studying Chinese in China, which is relatively newly industrialized, but so quickly, whereas it took 250 years in the West to move from feudalism to capitalism, in China it took no more than a few decades at most. It's a very rapid transition. But a transition occurred, and that transition from local to globalized capitalism changed the role of the modern family in the West. Okay, so let's go back to the family and the Industrial Revolution. As I said before, it was a revolution. It wasn't necessarily a revolution that came about through people going out with guns and shooting each other. But it was as profound a revolution than any other for all that. And it was driven by the change in the source of wealth from the land to what we call capital, that is to say raw materials and labour. And it was also driven simultaneously by the ownership of that wealth. So for centuries before, a small group of blood-related families called aristocrats or feudal owned huge tracts of land, and that ownership gave them not just economic power but political power as well, and therefore social power. But the Industrial Revolution changed the source of wealth. It changed the owners of those wealth from people who were for centuries relating to each other by blood to individuals who fought for that ownership through education, through canny economic management and so on, but who became as powerful as the previous feudal lords had been. I guess you would call them the industrial lords. So the ownership of wealth changed, but probably more profoundly in relation to our story of the family, what changed also was what we call the mode of production. That is to say, what people did in order to survive and to procreate. What did they do in feudal? I'll go back. We'll talk about the feudal system in a minute. But the mode of production relates to who produces what, how they do it, and why. So here's an illustration of a pre-industrial family. If you think here, the mode of production, the people who are producing here, I've chosen this picture in the background. Can you grab? Which one is grabbing that light behind you? There's a primitive little switch hanging down on the string. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, there's a dangling switch there. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Okay, that's better. All right, so in our picture we've got the pre-industrial family. This is relating to the point I made about the way things are produced, produces a sort of, or gives rise to and fosters a certain sort of family relationship. So in the background of here we've got not a factory, but someone's house. Okay. In the foreground, we've got four humans, three doing something, and the fourth, the infant, is hanging in the sling in the tree. So that what this picture indicates, quite profound, which is why I chose it, was that if we're talking about who produces what, where, and why, in relation to the way the family is organised, here we have all members of the family who can work, working. Obviously, the infant can't walk yet, so it's sitting up, watching the rest of the family working. But I guess you could say, I hadn't thought about this until this moment, but I guess you could say that the infant in sitting up and watching could also be learning a bit as well, in some sort of simplified manner. But certainly in the foreground, but at the same time, there's a set of relationships here between the individuals, just like they were in our family under the tree. And in the foreground, we have the male holding in his hand a tool. Remember we said our group under the tree, that part of the social relationships of a very primitive family changed because the men came to own or to see as their own property the tools that helped them survive. So this guy's got his scythe, I suppose, sort of hand scythe, with which he's cutting the corn, and this chap on his right is a little boy, probably about 7, 8 years old, who's helping his father, and behind him and in the background of the picture, which is one presumes the mother of both the children leaning over and herself using a tool to cut the grain. Now this is a fairly typical sort of feudal family, a family of feudal times, probably a little bit later than that. Looking at the clothes, I would say that probably this could be an illustration of maybe an early 17th century, late 16th century family. So it's really towards the end of the feudal system historically. But nevertheless, this grouping is clearly working, and it could perhaps be an American family. I noticed they've cleared trees in the background, so you could say this could also be an illustration of a colonial Australian family, perhaps. But they're clearly working for their survival together, outside, and producing food. They are not producing fridges or cars, and it's fairly clear that these people are not working for a wage. At least they're not going to rely on the wage in order to live, because they're cutting their own corn to make their bread. In such a family, in the pre-industrial family, there would be certain roles. Remember we said the very primitive family gave rise to certain expected roles once these groupings stopped moving around and became stable in one place. And the roles would be, and are indeed represented here, as gendered. That is to say, there are certain expected roles of men and of women, and out of those expectations there also rises certain power relationships. That is to say, some people have more power in the family than others. So in a patriarchal family, which is one of the theories you'll read about in your book, in a patriarchal family, the male will be the primary power source, if you like, the linchpin around which the rest of the group revolves. And here that picture illustrates that quite well. He will also have be the organizer. He certainly comes across of the labour that's performed in this family, and he comes across as that organizer quite well in that picture.